Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for today, which is December 1st, 2021. I'm going to take a look at the up and down patterns of relations between the United States and Russia, where there are appearances of an effort to have diplomatic engagement and moving back from the path of confrontation, even as the U.S. and NATO seem to be escalating the threats against Russia and talking about the likelihood that Russia will invade Ukraine at some point by perhaps the end of January or February. It was announced through sources to the Washington Post a day or two ago that there's a prospect for a Biden-Putin in-person summit sometime in early 2022. There is still a talk of a phone conversation in December. The talk of a meeting, an in-person meeting, comes following the visit by CIA Director William Burns to Moscow on November 2nd. Burns at that time raised the prospect of a summit. Now, Burns was the U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2005 to 2008. He's maintained good contacts there and has been carrying on discussions which are highly useful given the development of the tensions that are going on between the two nations. Just like China policy, there's an up and down pattern where one day there's a talk of a diplomatic discussion, for example, Biden talking with Xi Jinping. At the same time, U.S. congressmen are in Taiwan threatening to support Taiwanese independence, which would trigger a likely Chinese reaction to that. Biden saying the U.S. policy is a one China policy, which is the accepted international policy, and yet other officials, including military, State Department, and congressmen, are pushing for Taiwan independence. So you have these kinds of back and forth and contradictory statements. Just as an example, in reporting on the Burns visit to Moscow, the New York Times headline was, U.S.-Russian engagement deepens as CIA head travels to Moscow. But CNN titled its story, CIA director to Moscow to warn Russia over troop buildup. And this is a reference to the U.S. Intelligence lies that are reporting that the Russians are massing troops on the border of Ukraine, preparing an invasion. The actual issue here is, how do you de-escalate? Just as there was a de-escalation in July after the incident of the attack or the infringement by the British destroyer on Russian territorial waters near Crimea. This is taking place in the context of the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, visiting Brussels to show very unspecified photos that show allegedly Russian troops building up on the border. This has added to the tension where you have the Polish government calling for a permanent deployment of U.S. troops in Poland to deter Russian aggression. In response to these things, the spokesman for Putin, Peskov, said that Russian troops movement are, quote, exclusively our business, unquote. But then he added, Russia is threatening no one. We do not pose a danger to anyone. And he criticized what he called the rather aggressive expansionist tendencies of NATO, adding that, quote, Russia has always taken measures to ensure its security and will continue to do so, unquote. Troops on the Russian border with Ukraine, it is Russian territory, whereas what we're seeing through the Baltics into Ukraine are troops from other NATO countries that are not on the Russian border, that are bolstering the Ukrainian threat that they will move against the Russian ethnic enclave in the Donbas region and Luhansk. Now, what's behind this and why the Russians are concerned is that following the February 2014 coup, the regime change coup that was supported by neoliberals such as George Soros, neoconservatives such as Victoria Nuland from the State Department, and overseen by Joe Biden and also by Tony Blinken, who were at times on the scene orchestrating the Maidan Square coup. Well, after this happened, there were calls in Kiev from the Ukrainian government to crush what they called the Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. Now, the ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine have been there. They're Ukrainians, but they're also ethnic Russians. And they're very fearful of what would happen if the security forces in Ukraine that are tied to the Azov Battalion, the Pravi Sector, the hardcore right-wing, literal neo-Nazi units that trace their roots back to Stefan Bandera and the Ukrainians who joined the Nazi SS in the 1940s, early 40s, when Germany captured Ukraine. And the Ukrainian SS carried out extermination policies against Romanians, Hungarians, and ethnic Russians and Jews. And so these people are now in the heart of the defense sector and the security forces of the Kiev regime. And instead of negotiating in good faith with Russia, which was agreed to by the Normandy format and also by the Minsk talks, instead of good faith negotiations, they're threatening military attack and accusing Russia of invading Ukraine. So the latest story coming from Haines and U.S. security and others, that the Russians are possibly preparing an invasion, is pushing the Ukrainian government to demand more troops from NATO, to demand more weaponry, and to demand early entry into NATO, which would be a territorial expansion of NATO right up to the Russian borders. That's what the issue is. And yesterday and today there are NATO foreign ministers meeting in Latvia. And at the meeting yesterday, the U.S. announced support for eventual NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine. This goes explicitly against the agreement made between the United States and Russia at the end of the Cold War in 1990-91, when the Warsaw Pact dissolved and the Russians pulled back their troops based on an explicit understanding and a handshake that NATO would not expand eastward. But since then, there's been just a continued expansion eastward of NATO. And now they're trying to bring in Ukraine and Georgia, even while they're running regime change operations against Belarus. NATO, at this point, has frozen military contacts with Russia. In October, they expelled 8 diplomats from the Russian mission to NATO, and the Russians then pulled out the rest, so there's hardly any communication going on between Russia and NATO. So this is the background for this discussion of, will there be a face-to-face meeting between Biden and Putin, which is obviously necessary, but who's going to write the script for the U.S. side? The war hawks, the ones who see Russia as an enemy, and an enemy which must be combated with military hardware, troops, and an expansion of the alliance, or the possibility for cooperation. Now, coming up in early December, the 9th and 10th, Biden is going to host what they're calling a virtual summit for democracy, which will include the so-called democratic states who will reassert their commitment to anti-authoritarian government. Namely, they're going to map out a strategy for containment of Russia and China. This is hardly a basis for peace. There are many avenues for discussions for cooperation, including work together against the pandemic, including work to stabilize the situation in Afghanistan, where the United States is part of something called the extended troika of Russia, China, the United States, and Pakistan. But as long as the U.S. continues to freeze the funds to the Afghan government, the situation will get worse in Afghanistan. There are other areas for cooperation, including the cleaning up of the terrorist enclave in Syria, and work together to stabilize the situation between the West and Iran. So there's a lot of areas where there are mutual concerns and a potential for mutual benefit. But the war hawk propaganda against Russia continues. And as we saw with Russiagate, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. Remember, there was a huge hue and cry, but why isn't Trump doing something about Russian bounties paid to Taliban fighters to kill Americans? And it turned out it was just another false report from the intelligence community. So when you hear these stories, when you're being whipped into a frenzy over the Russian aggression or the Chinese aggression, keep in mind that the sources of these stories are the same ones who said Putin was controlling Trump and Putin elected Trump through devious activities in the 2016 election, which were never proven to be the case. In fact, the story that Russia hacked the DNC computers proves to be false. As the head of CrowdStrike, which was the cybersecurity company hired to defend the Democratic Party computers, admitted in congressional testimony in December 2017 they had no evidence of a Russian exfiltration of files. In other words, Bill Binney was right, the former NSA technical director Binney, who stated that it was most likely a thumb drive or some kind of local download as opposed to a hack. So the whole story of Russiagate, as we're seeing now from the Durham reports, was a fraud. What's the reason for it? The war hawks need an enemy. And that's why we're having this new screeching about Russia and Ukraine. Don't fall for it. Now, I'll be back tomorrow with another update. We'll probably look at the economy a little more as the inflation problem continues.